Okay, so today I will be sharing some research with you that I've basically only just begun. So this is very much still a work in progress, but I'm very excited to share what I've come to so far with my research. So J.R.R. Tolkien's legendarium, on which The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and posthumously The Silmarillion form only a part, was the work of a lifetime. These works were original creations rooted in medieval and mythological traditions, a preoccupation which can be traced throughout his lifetime. However, Tolkien's works written for his secondary world, also known as Arda, were not the only texts which he composed. Indeed, the collected poems of J.R.R. Tolkien, which you can see here, were recently published in 2024 and edited by Christina Scull and Wayne G. Hammond, giving scholars and readers alike access to previously lesser studied and unknown poems from Tolkien's back catalogue, previously hidden in his vast archive of papers. Amongst these 3 volumes, there's 3 of these massive tomes. The editors also included the 13 works which he composed for the volume Songs for the Philologists, which today's talk will be about. These are primarily medievalist poems and songs composed to tunes and rhythm, like rhymes, which were popular in the primary modern world at the time of composition. And it is these texts that you can see, or from this tiny volume on the left, which today's lecture will be considering. So Tolkien's engagement with the northern medievalist tradition has always been emphasized through scholarship, primarily the Norse and Old English literary and linguistic traditions. Tom Shippey, he argues that the power of Tolkien's writing almost self-evidently had something to do with his job. That job, of course, being his work as a philologist, specializing in medieval language and literature. Jane Chance also notes that where Tolkien turned to find the stuff and fabric for his mythology for England was clearly the medieval world he knew so well from his scholarly studies. However, in recent years, we've also seen the rise in alternative Tolkienian scholarship centered around Tolkien's other interests. These include the classical inspiration for his works, a background which he acquired through his initial classical studies here at Oxford, and his engagement with modern literature, as argued by Holly Ordway in 2021 in her seminal monograph, Tolkien's Modern Reading. As Verlyn Flieger recognizes, there is a very common tendency to conflate Tolkien's medieval scholarship with his creative work. Because we know that Tolkien was a scholar of medieval literature and language, we assume that he must necessarily have written his fiction in the same mode in which he studied and taught. And we are partly right. Middle-earth, of course, owes much to the Middle Ages, and Tolkien's deep and broad debt to medieval source material in The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion has been rightly acknowledged by scholars. Ordway, however, notes that, yes, Tolkien was, above all things, a medievalist. That is obvious, and it cannot be gainsaid, but it does not follow that he had no interest in literature beyond the Middle Ages. Indeed, not all of Tolkien's compositions became subsumed into his secondary world. Some did, but not all of them. This is particularly true for Songs for the Philologists. Indeed, Songs for the Philologist is a conflation of Tolkien's modern reading with that of his medieval interests. While the lyrics he composed build upon his job as a philologist and lecturer, the texts are not fully medieval. In fact, there's very little attempt to imitate Old English meter, for example, and any other standard rhetorical and poetic devices within the lyrics. There are some, but they're not the primary focus of the texts. Instead, the lyrics are set to imitate the rhythms of nursery rhymes and follow the tunes of modern melodies, creating intricate and complex hybrid compositions which are simultaneously neither modern nor medieval, and both at the same time. Now, there are 2 elements to today's talk: an examination of Tolkien's as a parodist and a re-examination of the lesser-known work known as Songs for the Philologists. So first of all, what do I mean by describing Tolkien as a parodist, given how parody is very often considered an intertextual attack or contentious response to another text? How can this term be applicable to Tolkien? So Jane Chance notes that Tolkien had a taste for parody. This is clear from the existence of these 13 early poems using medieval languages, verse, and metrical forms, written at Leeds in the 20s with E.V. Gordon, and in 1936 appeared in an unpublished University College of London anthology of 30 pages entitled Songs for the Philologists. Indeed, Tolkien, in Songs for the Philologists, attempts to a specific parody of texts, not of its messages or themes. However, before we get to the further exploration of Tolkien as a parodist and what is fully meant by this, we first need to reintroduce the Songs for the Philologists. So how many in the room have actually heard of Songs for the Philologists? Actually, quite a few of you. That's really good. So Songs for the Philologists was privately printed in the Department of English at University College London in 1936. The volume contains a mixture of traditional songs and original verses translated into Old English, Old Norse, and Gothic to fit traditional English tunes. Sarah Balif Straubhaar describes Songs of the Philologists as a collection of convivial drinking songs, and to a certain extent that is true. E.V. Gordon and Tolkien, both lecturing on English language at Leeds, assisted the students with the formation of a Viking club at Leeds University in the 1920s. Tolkien, in his application letter for the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professorship of Anglo-Saxon here at Oxford in 1925, notes how the Viking Club was formed by past and present students of Old Icelandic, which promised to continue their friendly rivalry and open debate with the literary assembly independently of staff. The club's main purpose was to read and discuss Old Icelandic texts, and they less seriously also invented and sang songs on pub evenings. Of the 30 songs in this collection, 13 were contributed by Tolkien, as you will see here. So this is a table that I collected based upon the information around the Songs for the Philologists and Tolkien's contribution in particular. So 6 of the texts that Tolkien wrote were written in Old English and 6 were written in Modern English, with only 1 written in Gothic, well, this being the only text that we know that Tolkien wrote in Gothic. The songs were all written over the span of 2 years, in 1924 and 1928, potentially, we're not 100% sure, dated thus by editors Christina Scull and Wayne G. Hammond through the E.V. Gordon archive in Leeds. Interestingly, half of Tolkien's contribution to the volume drew from nursery rhymes and children's song tunes, while the second half adopt the melodies of folk songs, and we also get an anti-war ditty as well. Songs for the Philologists also contain 12 songs with lyrics in Nordic languages, 11 in Old Norse and Icelandic, and 1 in Swedish, with an Icelandic translation appended as well. None of these were written by Tolkien, but were instead authentic texts. Indeed, in a recent 2025 study, Straubhaar examined the 12 Old Norse songs included in the collection, noting how 7 of the Old Norse songs and the only Latin song included in Song for the Philologists were also later added to the Icelandic University Student Songbook, which is a real thing, also called Tumakuka, or the Mimir Songbook, which was printed some 50 years later in 1973. Mimir was a club for students in Icelandic studies, and their songbook, Tumakuka, served a similar purpose to the Leeds Student Vikings Club's own Songs for the Philologists. Straubhaar proposes that the Old Norse texts were contributed by Gordon, who visited Iceland twice, and whose interest in the Icelandic language led to him to found the Icelandic honors course at Leeds. Okay, so Songs for the Philologists is often regarded as the rarest and most difficult to find of the Tolkien books. Actually, today on the news, I just saw that they found another one of these very few books, and that it might be selling for £65,000, something like that. It is rare indeed. In 1935 or 1936, Dr. A.H. Smith of University College London, a former student of Tolkien at Leeds, apparently gave a copy of one of the typescripts to a group of students to print at the private printing press as a printing exercise. This was an Elizabethan printing press. As such, we can assume that there weren't that many copies printed originally. Smith, from what I have gathered, later realized that he had not asked for permission from either Tolkien or Gordon before printing. And so the completed booklets were never distributed either. And on top of that, most of the copies were destroyed in a fire at the college during World War II, where the press and copies of the books were stored. But some copies survived, perhaps retained by the students who printed them. And then the number of that survive of Songs for the Philologists is unknown, but it is potentially very small. We do have a copy here at the Bodleian, but we also, I do believe that we have one at Leeds as well. But apart from that, I'm not really sure where the other ones are. Probably in private collections someplace. In the center of the title page for Songs for the Philologists, as you can see over there by the arrow, we have a quotation from the Eddic poem Sigrifumau. There we go. Malruna Skaltukunna, you shall learn the runes of language, reflecting and reinforcing the interest of the Viking Club in Northern European languages, both living and dead. Okay, so now that we have some further background information about Songs for the Philologists, let's consider the second aspects of today's lecture, Tolkien and the Parodist. So parody, despite its very long literary history, is very difficult to define. Due to his classical background, Tolkien probably would have known of the twofold senses of ancient parody, reflected through Aristotle's definition of parodia. The first sense of parodia refers to a narrative poem in a meter and vocabulary of epic poems, but treating a light, satirical, or mock heroic subject. However, there is no evidence that it mocked the original text, but instead it imitated the main epics for comic effect. The second sense of parodia refers to a quotation, not necessarily humorous, in which writers and speakers introduce allusions to previous texts. This is, from what I gathered, the most common use of the term. Parody is thus a form of metafiction. In that parodying one text, the parody text holds up a mirror to its own fictional practices, so that it is at once both fiction and a fiction about fictions. Yael Schlick also highlights that metafiction tends to be highly intertextual, aware of literary traditions and its own place within it, something Tolkien definitely was. Intertextuality in itself is a very complicated term and has since been in use since the mid-20th century to discuss a range of intertextual influences and derivations across space and time. Sarah Gordon, for example, summarizes intertextuality as consisting of a range of textual devices such as imitation, allusion, reference, indirect reference, citation, quotation, and insertion. All of these ones which are also present in Songs of the Philologists. We also have two types of text that we need to consider. We have the hypertext, which is the original text, and then we have the hypertext, which is the transformation that Tolkien would have created. And it is interesting to note that as we use language, which is not necessarily our own, to a greater or lesser extent, we also do make it our own, which is what Tolkien does by creating these imitations or these translations and adaptations. Okay, however, Tolkien would also have been influenced by the trench culture, which he experienced during World War I. Indeed, singing was a pronounced feature of the Great War. Graham Seal, in describing trench culture, notes how the soldiers have songs of their own, songs of the march, the trench, the billet and battle. Usually the soldiers' creations were to the tunes of popular songs as well, popular songs of the war or immediate pre-war period. Other borrowed hymns, like hymn tunes that were fashioned to age-old melodies as well. After 3 years of warfare, the lyrics tended to express generally resignation, bleak humor, and a desire to be out of the war. The hybrid trench compositions with original lyrics to popular songs mirrors Tolkien's own creative process when composing his philological contributions to the songs of the Philologists. Tolkien's hybrid approach grounds this lead's songbook creatively firmly in Tolkien's Great War output, but adapted to the philological teaching purpose of the Viking Club, the Malruna Skaltukuna, on the very title page of the songs. Not only does he comment on linguistic preoccupations in 2 of the modern English texts, but he also adopts the melodies of a common trench song for 2 of his own creations, thus directly bringing this trench culture in contact with his medieval preoccupations. And that is what we'll be covering first. So as you can see in this middle section here, this is a photo from the text, from the actual manuscript. There is actually very minimal information provided by Gordon and Tolkien about the melodies assigned to each of the poems in Songs for the Philologists. Indeed, when I started flipping through the collection, I noticed that the melody O'Reilly appeared in conjunction with 3 poems, Lahuru and Natura Apis, which is also called Morali Ricardi Eremite, both Tolkien's creations, as well as the more ambiguously named Icelandic song. Its original title is That liggur svo makalaust and was written by Bjarni Thorsteinsson, who was alive from 1861 to 1938, and was probably one of Gordon's additions to the collection. It is interesting, however, how the song has also been set to the tune of O'Reilly, despite being an authentic creation. The first 2 out of the 3 verses of Thorsteinsson's original have been retained, as well as the first line of the refrain, which is repeated 4 times in Tolkien's creation, similarly to the repetition of a single line in the refrain in Lahuru and Natura Apis. I found the commonality of this tune across 3 different texts in the collection to be instantly interesting, as its shortened title made for quite the mystery. Besides, O'Reilly is the only melody which occurs more than once in the entire collection, making for an intriguing anomaly, basically. And after some browsing, I came across Are You the O'Reilly? Blimey O'Reilly, You're Looking Well, which was originally written by the Irish-American Vaudevillian Pat Rooney, who was alive from 1848 to 1892. And he published it released it in 1883. It was later revived in 1915 by P. Emmett and popularized by the recording of American singer Billy Murray. It was a song which gained great popularity during the First World War. Its social cultural context, as well as the length of verses and refrain, make Are You the O'Reilly a highly likely candidate for Tolkien's short form label, tune label O'Reilly. Indeed, I also have a newspaper a newspaper clipping here from the New York Tribune, which describes Are You the O'Reilly when discussing the prevalence of so-called anti-war ditties, noting how O'Reilly is a song that all the soldiers are singing now that Tipperary is no longer in vogue in the trenches. The newspaper notes that despite the song being an American product, quote, the English soldier, having a psychosis all his own when choosing lofty themes for battle hymns, picked Mr. Riley as the man towards whom he could direct his dying thoughts, end quote. The eponymous O'Reilly, the lyric tells us, was a former pub server who the word war turned into a commissary worker, reflecting both Tolkien's own past displacement from student to soldier during the Great War, as well as the current pub setting in which Tolkien's songs would have been sung in the present. Lahuru, which is the eighth of Tolkien's contribution, is the only one of Tolkien's contributions to Songs for the Philologist, which is explicitly a drinking song in celebration of drink and drinking. with Tolkien's other poems and songs being more thematically related to the philological didactic program of the Viking Club, as we will discuss later. Similarly to O'Reilly, Lahuru is a 3-stanza song, each consisting of 4 verse lines and a refrain. Unlike O'Reilly, Tolkien's Lahuru, Huru's refrain consists of a repetition of a single line 4 times. Lahuru, Lahuru, la liofa, lahu. Oh truly, oh beloved, oh how. And on your handout, you have the entirety of the song, but I thought I could read out the Old English just to get you an idea of how it actually would have sounded like. I'm not going to sing it because I don't know the melody too well, but like the rhythm itself is really nice. So, Yalahu in winsome theos vorol to nicht, and modgu and mirgu theos deorer gedrygt. Här is blad, här is bliss, här is rådor and hicht. Nis harna ni paka, ne prachtas ne plicht. Lahuru, lahuru, la leofa lahu. 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 Her is medu and beorthegu, ealu and ween, and hunig and hailu and healu fomin. Ich trinke, ich schenke betin, we habath upornath no sin sidum tin. Lahuru, lahuru, la leofa lahu, lahuru, lahuru, la leofa lahu. Lahuru, lahuru, la leofa lahu, lahuru, lahuru, la leofa lahu. Ich blaffige, ich woffige, ich wedes vad tu drucknast, tu drymest, tu drysnigast nu. Tu sprälast, tu svällast, vad snottras, vad svällnast. La, vad visses är svälkne, je bör svabistu. Lahuru, lahuru, la leofa lahu. 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 So this hybrid poem is actually a masterclass in both Old English composition and adherence to an existing rhythm and tune. I think the final stanza has some difficulties because some of the lines are too long for the actual number of syllables within the line, which makes for especially lines 3 and 4 very difficult to keep within the rhythm, as you might have heard. So not only is it possible to easily sing the poem to the melody of Are You the O'Reilly, or like speak it in a specific rhythm, due to the number of syllables per line and the end rhyme, but Tolkien also attempts to adhere to the poetic conventions of Old English poetry, particularly the 4 strong stresses per line in the verses and the presence of alliteration throughout the poem. So here I've tried to spell out the number of strong stresses, which you can see as the slash, and the weak, the non-stressed as the X's. And in Old English poetry, there are only 4 strong stresses per line, 2 per half line. I haven't added in the half line section here because Tolkien himself didn't. But for the first one, the line probably would have been around here for the Zebura. And the alliteration, which you can see across here, which is the commonality of the letters across the line, the repetition of the initial letter, would have linked across the 2 half lines in the original, if it had been an original Old English song. So structural alliteration per Old English convention is not entirely rigidly adhered to. Typically, alliteration in Old English poetry connects 2 half lines across the caesura. The caesura doesn't exist here. With the third stress, which is this one, this one, this one, and this one from the first stanza, it would have been the determining head stave, so the alliterative letter that determines the other alliterative letters across the line. But without the need for the caesura, Tolkien is free to experiment with the alliteration in Lahuru, occasionally pairing alliteration in separate groups of 2. So as you can see here, Morgu and Mirgu and Diora and Jedricht. And here on line 3, we have Blad and Bliss and Rodor and Hicht. So you can see alliterative pairs, which is not common at all in Old English. We also have, alliteration stresses in 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, like these pairings, and other times in both conventionals, so stresses 2 and 3 and line 1, and unconventional patterns, which is stresses in, let's see. Yeah, so like when you have a stress in like the second, third, and fourth stress, for example, being the similar, which you can see on the final line here, which is very unconventional as well. With the fourth stress rarely alliterating in traditional Old English poetry. Aside from the structural alliteration, this section here also shares syntactic similarities with the Wanderer. The Lahuru verse line, Her is bleir, her is bliss, her is hroðar and hytt, is a direct parallel to the Wanderer, but inverted. The original reading, Her byth feolaina, ha byth freonlaina, her byth monlaina, ha byth maiglaina. Your money is fleeting, your friend is fleeting, your man is fleeting, your kinsman is fleeting. The two lines from The Wanderer, a poem that we know Tolkien knew very well, both through the Oxford curriculum and through his repeated adaptations of it, is part of, these two lines are part of the longest Ubisund passage, which laments the general decay of the world in which we live in an anticipation of death and Judgment Day. Very fun. Tolkien's anaphoric repetition of Heris is not part of the lament, however, but instead emphasizes all the good which the people are drinking and sharing in the present. So basically the complete opposite. So what they have in the present is like, here there is splendor, here is bliss, here is solace and hope. And the anaphoric repetition continues in Tolkien's descriptions of what the drinkers are not experiencing, both through the emphatic negative nis nainig and the repetition of ne. Here there is no deceits, no tricks or risks. The listing of positive association with their drinking party continues into stanza 2 as well, which you can also see on the screen here, elevated by internal rhyme and even end rhyme, which is also incredibly uncommon in Old English poetry. There's a couple of instances, but they're uncommon. While there are no surviving drinking songs from the Old English period, it is easy to imagine Tolkien's Lahuru in the context of early English feasting culture, as exemplified by poems such as Beowulf. Hugh Magennis, for example, in a monograph on the images of community in Old English poetry, describes how drinking in Old English literature is presented in a way which would not alienate a Christian audience, which results in no descriptions of drunkenness or unsavory behavior, basically. While drinking is liberal in Beowulf, it is not riotous, and it is not inconsistent with the tastes of a Christian audience and Christian readership. Indeed, Anglo-Saxon teaching with regard to alcohol accepts the place of drinking in communal life, but basically condemns excess. So basically, as a conclusion to this mini section, is that we find that Tolkien is as an imitator, imitates the textual culture, which was very prominent in the trench culture, seeing or taking a very popular text from his own war experience and adapting it into something which is a lot more pleasant, something that brings joy instead of sadness. So, moving into the second part of the lecture. So the tension between the fields of literature and language was a subject which occupied Tolkien throughout his academic career at Leeds and Oxford. Tolkien was a philologist. Indeed, in a later letter from 1958, he notes that I am a philologist, not a linguist, but he could see that his subject was dying out. It's still dying out, but we're still surviving. We're still floating. In the Department of English at the University of Oxford, where Tolkien worked, teaching was and still is divided into two streams. As such, when Tolkien applied for the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professorship of Anglo-Saxon in 1925, he emphasized that he wished to continue in a wider and more fertile field, that the encouragement of philological enthusiasm amongst the young. This objective he had successfully accomplished in Leeds alongside Evie Gordon, in which the study of philology appeared to have lost its connotations of terror, if not mystery, amongst the students. In his Oxford valedictorian address on the 5th of June 1959, before he left his second professorial chair, he spoke of the rivalry between literature and language and of the popular myth that, quote, Lang came from the cuckoo's egg laid in the nest, in which he takes up too much room and usurps the worm of the lit chicken, end quote. And that, quote, lit was a cuckoo bent on extruding her nest fellow or sitting on him, end quote. But neither side was normally exclusive, neither the sole property of this or that scholar, nor the sole object of any one course of study. Indeed, Tolkien had previously noted in his application letter to his first professorial chair in 1925, how linguistic and literary studies can never be enemies except by misunderstanding or without loss to both. When reflecting on George Gordon, another Gordon, Gordon's leadership in Leeds in the early 1920s, Tolkien praised Gordon's encouragement of the development of the medieval and linguistic side, and, quote, a friendly rivalry grew up between the two, nearly equal divisions, end quote, here potentially referring to the rivalry between the Lit and Lang schemes. He further elaborated that each had its own seminars and there were sometimes combined meetings, quite the happiest and most balanced school he had ever seen. However, the division between literature and language in the English schools at both Leeds and Oxford were intentionally designed to appeal to different student interests, and it had a practical effect on the rivalry between the two courses within the field. Indeed, Tom Shippey notes that for most of his active life, Tolkien taught Old English, Middle English, and the history of the English language. And in doing so, he was competing with teachers of English literature for time, funds, and students, on the whole, a very thankless task. So, Lit and Lang was the final poem by Tolkien in Songs of the Philologists and was written to the tune of a nursery rhyme, Polly Put the Kettle On, in 1924. This division between literature and philology is the subject of the present poem in modern English. Once there were two groups called Lit and Lang. Lit was lazy till she died. Lit was lazy till she died. Lit was lazy till she died of homothemes. I don't like philology, poor Lit said. Psychotherapeutics failed and now she's dead. Doctors cut up all the corpse, but searched in vain. They couldn't find it anywhere. They couldn't find the brain. Did Lang go into mourning weeds? I don't think. He quickly wiped a tear away and had another drink. Yeah. In Songs to Middle-earth, The Road to Middle-earth, Tom Shippey comments that the poem is the worst Tolkien ever wrote. Quote, so bad indeed that it makes me think or hope that something must have gone wrong with it en route to the printer, end quote. Polly Put the Kettle On, the nursery rhyme for which Tolkien relied on this rhythm and structure, is also incredibly simplistic. One line repeated 3 times, followed by a single different line. So Polly put the kettle on times 3. We all have tea. And Suki take it off again times 3. They've gone all away. The additions of lines 9 to 12 and 21 to 24, so these 4 final lines on each stanza, were Tolkien's own addition. There is no direct source for anything like this in the original text. But despite the poem's overwhelmingly simplistic structure, deviating from most of Tolkien's more complex narrative poetry, Tolkien still managed to play with the rivalry between linguistic and literary fields within these 24 lines, despite the fact that most of them are exactly the same line. For example, in the original nursery rhyme, Polly and Suki were common nicknames for Mary and Susan. The use of nicknames is reflected in the 2 rivaling fields outlined within this poem, with Lit being the abbreviation for English literature, the study of works from Shakespeare to modern times, whereas lang signified English language, meaning the philological study of Old English through texts such as Beowulf, the Wanderer, the Battle of Maldon, and Middle English such as the Gawain and the Green Knight. Throughout the poem, Tolkien criticizes the literary field, noting how it rejects the two fields as being homophemes. In line 8, a word denoting how different words and phrases, which when pronounced are made with the exact same apparent lip movement, for example, emphasizing the similarities between the two fields. And despite the apparent similarities, literature is unwilling to engage in psychotherapeutics, relating to the treatment of mental illness by discussing someone's problems with them instead of using drugs or operations, simply because it did not like philology. Tolkien thus seems to note that by refusing to engage with the language course, even through discussion, the literary field would inevitably die due to its brainless stubbornness. If it were to apply the metaphor Tolkien introduced in his later valedictorian speech, in Let and Lang, Tolkien seems to depict lit as the cuckoo trying to push its nest fellow out of the nest, but in the process causing itself harm, rather than engaging in conversation or shared space. Indeed, in his manifesto, the Oxford English School from 1930, Tolkien makes it clear that he considers both linguistic and literary approaches too narrow for a full response to a work of art, especially early works of art, and that philology was the middle ground which one should approach English texts through. And then we have the Frenchman Froth, which is the 12th and penultimate of Tolkien's contributions in Songs for the Philologists. I believe it's on the final side, maybe. Yeah. I restructured it at the very last minute, so sorry about that for the handout. So the Frenchman Froth reflects not his difficulties with philology's place within the field of English to the same extent, but his personal dislike for the French language and its effect on early English as a developing language. Particularly, he comments on what he considered the adverse effects of French upon the English language as the result of the Norman conquest in 1066. English, he notes, is a language that could move easily in abstract concepts from French was still a vulgar Norman patois, but had become adulterated with a large Franco-Latin ingredient largely floating around like oil. In his essay on English and Welsh, Tolkien notes how French and Latin together were my first experience with second-learned languages. Latin seemed so normal that pleasure or distaste was equally inapplicable. French was given to me less of this pleasure than any other language with which I have sufficient acquaintance for this judgment. In 1958, when responding to a query asking for facts about himself, Tolkien notes that some facts have some relation to an author's work, though knowledge of them does not really explain the works, such as, quote, I dislike French and prefer Spanish to Italian, but that unraveling his linguistic preferences would not change or influence the person's reading of said works. So, however, Frenchman's Froth is a deliberate exaggeration of prejudice against the French language and should be read in the spirit of parody. The text itself is based upon the melody from a satirical tune, The Vicar of Bray. The Vicar of Bray is an 18th century satirical song recounting the career of the Vicar of Bray and his contortions of principle, including his faith and his politics to suit the ruling monarch, in order to retain his ecclesiastical office despite the changes in the church through the reigns of several English monarchs. The song makes many specific allusions to English religion and political doctrines and events. The Frenchman, too, is filled with many specific allusions, but rather than having them be to religion or politics, Tolkien highlights details of French pronunciation, the many borrowings from French into English, and the abysmal state of the English language in contemporary education. So in the first stanza of the poem, Tolkien appears to lament particularly the sounds of the French language. So, though Frenchmen froth with furious sound and fill our frosty mansions, and gurgling uvula aground, and tremblers pay attention, though history roll in dreary round colonial expansion, and king and parliamentary hound and constitutional sanction, this is my faith I do maintain until the stars shall fall, sir. Let other lands be what they claim in England, best of all, sir. So, as you can see here, there's quite a lot of color variation. So everything in gray is French, like French-derived words. Everything in this like greenish blue are Germanic, but like words from other Germanic languages apart from Old English. And the words in red are Latin-derived words. We also have pajamas here, which is from Persian, but I was like, it's just one word. The rest of them are derived from Old English, mostly. So described by Tolkien as froth, the French language is much exaggerated in the poem. Froth, an abbreviated form of frothing at the mouth, is a severely amplified description of the animated speech of the French, which creates a furious sound. The choice of the phrase "fill our frowsty mansion" is also very intentional. The OD entry for fusty, which is the closest analogy to Fausti, indicates a sense of that which has lost its freshness, stale smelling, or musty. The collocation of staleness with mansions and the way in which the tremblers must pay attention could thus indicate the way in which the Anglo-Norman nobles brought their language with them after the Norman conquest, making French the language of the nobility. The king and the English Parliament, parliamentary hound, and judicial system, the constitutional sanction until early modern history. While there are some words such as froth, gurgling, and round from other Germanic languages, from other Germanic origin, it is worth noting that the majority of the words are either derived from Old English, which are primarily base words, or borrowed from a Romance language, such as the French words, and as well as some specialist terms from Latin. In the final stanzas of Freshman's Froth, Tolkien again highlights the rivalry between literature and language. Though some may strip their stupid souls, at least to their pajamas, though sage green with puny poles write dismal little dramas, the critics gibber in their holes of style and form and meter, yet literature, the little moles, they miss her when they meet her. This is my faith I do maintain, while songs by men are sung, sir, they only earn the English name who learn the English tongue, sir. So in Frenchman's Froth, Tolkien acts as a true parodist in the traditional sense. He's not parodying the textual genre, but imitates a text which is already satiric in nature and simply changes the subject matter to make fun of the disjointed relationship between the two academic fields, which he believes should work together to create better scholarship. Tolkien criticizes literature critics for their puny poles, which means small heads, and for gibbering, to speak rapidly or inarticulately. I can't say that word today. To chatter unintelligibly, mirroring the lack of a brain in the corpus of literature in Lit and Lang. Indeed, Tolkien notes how literature critics often miss her when they meet her, implying that they do not always pay attention to that which they should, and how style, form, and meter are not the only criteria for good literature. So I do have a final section too, but I think we're running out of time, so I'll just do this very quickly. This is a very, very, still very much a work in progress. Tolkien's parodies of folk songs and children's songs. So basically, I already knew that I would run out of time with this one, and because it is a much bigger corpus of texts than the imitation of trench song, like singing culture, and his parodies of like this philological split. And I do think it does need some further study. As I noted at the start of today's lecture, 9 out of the 13 texts which Tolkien composed for the volume are based on tunes from folk songs and children's songs. Lazy Sheep, Pray Tell Me Why, and Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, the melodic sources for Bag Me Bloma, the Gothic song, and Eadig Beosu were both written by English poet and novelist Jane Taylor. Meanwhile, from what I can gather, Three Wise Men of Gotham, I Love Sixpence, Who Killed Cock Robin, and Polly Put the Kettle On were all common nursery rhymes in the late Victorian period. I believe that the reason Tolkien chose famous and well-known songs for the sources, either to adapt with new lyrics or to translate into Old English, had to do with the role of imitation for the developing brain. In explaining the literary genre of parody, Simon Dentith notes how imitation is the way in which we learn to speak, taking in, as we do so, not merely a grammar or a vocabulary, but a whole repertoire of manners, attitudes, and the way of speaking. And parodic imitation of another's words is merely one possibility among the whole range of rejoinders that make up human discourse. Parody, so in the text that Tolkien translates and or adapts lyrics from one language to another, he both attempts to retain the end rhyme and syllables from the original source text into the original, in order to still be able to sing the song to its set melody, while also retaining the overall meaning. As such, someone with lesser knowledge of the hyper language, so the original language, into which the text is being translated, can still follow the text as long as they possess knowledge of that original text. This Tolkien attempts to do in his adaptation of Who Killed Cock Robin, named Hurukana, and I Love Sixpence, also known as 6 Minutes. However, Tolkien also adapted folk songs, such as The Mermaid, written by AJC. We don't really know the full name, but it is possibly William Makepeace Thackeray. Orfeu Widnegarseg, which is Tolkien's adaptation of it, employs a very different translation technique, favoring a domesticating translation, which transforms more modern language into Old English dictionary, diction. The song also incorporates words from the patriotic song, Rule Britannia, in the chorus. But I think we'll skip that, unfortunately, even though it is very cool. Because in Tolkien's own translation, he substitutes Latin terms with more generalized and mysterious language, which is more common in Old English. And instead of the Rule Britannia lines, he uses lines from Beowulf, like the opening lines of Beowulf, to create this more mysterious, this evocative refrain, which is really interesting and something that I haven't really seen him do as much before, actually incorporating entire lines. So, to conclude, I hope that this lecture has provided you with some further insight into Tolkien's Songs of the Philologists' hybrid creations, exemplifying both his medieval and modern parodic interests. While he does occasionally produce parodies in the derogatory and mocking sense, particularly in his discussions of the state of the English field and its refusal to reunite under one banner, most of his texts are imitating in nature. He marries Old English poetic devices with modern songwriting, keeping the form which make the poems recognizably Old English, while also adapting end rhymes to keep the rhythm and melody of its source text. Tolkien's early non-secondary world poetic creations are worth more consistent study. And I hope that this lecture is the first step on such a scholarly journey, both for me and for you as well. Yeah, thank you.